Deputy Sarah Evans began her morning as usual, patrolling the winding, often deserted backroads of her rural Kentucky county. She enjoyed these early hours when the fog still clung to the fields and the world seemed to stir awake at its own gentle pace. Her patrol car moved steadily, the hum of the engine blending with the faint chirping of birds in the trees lining the road. She knew every curve and bend here, every tree that had withstood the test of time. But this morning, something felt off. A strange sense crept over her, a kind of alertness she couldn't ignore. Sarah prided herself on her instincts. They kept her safe through tough calls and long nights on the job. As she rounded a bend, her eyes caught movement on the roadside. She slowed the car, her hand moving instinctively to her flashlight as she peered out the window. There, on the side of the road, a small, scrappy-looking dog paced nervously around a bulky, worn duffel bag. The dog's fur was a patchwork of different shades, matted in places, as if he'd been left on his own for some time. Sarah furrowed her brow. It wasn't every day you saw a dog this far out, especially guarding what looked like someone's lost belongings. She parked her cruiser a little further up the road, watching the animal closely. As she stepped out, Sarah murmured softly to herself, "What's going on here, boy?" The dog snapped his head up, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. His gaze was intense, almost pleading, but defensive. She could tell he was protecting the bag. Her instincts went on high alert. It wasn't just any abandoned animal. She could see the tension in his stance, the way his body hovered protectively over the duffel bag as if whatever lay within it was worth his every ounce of energy to protect. "All right, let's take this slow," she whispered, easing one foot forward. The dog let out a low, warning growl, his eyes never leaving her. She stopped, keeping her hands visible, speaking in a calming voice. "Easy, buddy. I'm not here to hurt you." Reaching for her radio, she called for backup, her voice steady. "Jake, I've got a situation out here on Willow Bend Road. Might need a hand with a very committed guard dog and an abandoned bag. Mind coming by?" Static buzzed for a second, and then Jake's voice crackled over the radio. "On my way. Hang tight, Sarah." She felt a bit of relief. Jake was her trusted partner, a solid backup who'd been by her side in many tough situations. But as she waited, Sarah kept her eyes trained on the dog. He hadn't moved an inch, but she could see the exhaustion in his body, the desperation in his eyes. She took a breath, wondering what could be so important to this little creature. As she waited for Jake, the morning quiet felt heavier, the sense of mystery growing. Something told her that whatever was in that bag, this encounter was far from ordinary. Sarah could hear the faint sound of her partner Jake's car approaching, but she kept her focus on the dog, who was still tense, his eyes fixed on her every movement. She knew that approaching a protective animal was a delicate task, especially one as determined as this scruffy mutt seemed to be. Jake pulled up beside her cruiser and stepped out, raising an eyebrow as he approached. "You called for backup on a dog?" he teased lightly, but his tone shifted when he saw the intense look on her face and the cautious stance of the dog. "All right, guess this isn't just any stray." "Definitely not," Sarah replied, keeping her voice low. "He's guarding that bag, and I don't know what's in it, but he's acting like it's the most important thing in the world." Jake took a careful look at the dog, assessing the situation with a serious expression. "Looks like he's been out here a while. Probably hasn't had food or water in a bit. Maybe we could use that to our advantage." Sarah nodded, reaching into her patrol car to grab an unopened bottle of water and a small snack bar she kept on hand. She slowly tore open the wrapper, the crinkle of the package causing the dog's ears to perk up, though his body remained firmly planted between them and the duffel bag. Jake crouched down beside her, his hands open and calm. "Hey, buddy, we're not here to take anything from you," he said in a soothing tone, extending a piece of the snack toward the dog. "You look like you could use a bite." The dog's eyes darted between Jake and Sarah, his body tensing even more. For a second, he glanced at the food, his nose twitching, but he didn't budge from his post. Sarah tried a different approach, speaking in a warm, calm voice. "It's okay, boy. You're a good dog, aren't you? Just looking out for something important." She took another cautious step forward, crouching down to make herself appear less threatening. I promise, we're not here to hurt you. The dog seemed to soften slightly, his growls subsiding, though he still watched them carefully. Jake took this opportunity to move slowly, just close enough to offer the dog a closer look at the water. As Jake set the bottle down on the ground and cracked the cap open slightly, Sarah noticed the dog's eyes flicker between the two of them and the food. For the first time, the dog relaxed enough to sniff the ground near the bottle. Jake and Sarah exchanged a hopeful glance. It was a small victory, but they knew they had to earn his trust fully if they were going to get close to that bag. "Good boy," Jake whispered as they both waited, maintaining their calm presence. Sarah's curiosity about the bag grew as the seconds ticked by, but she kept her focus on the dog. Whatever he was protecting, it was important enough that he was willing to risk everything, even in his tired, hungry state. With patience, they waited, giving the dog the space he needed to feel comfortable. Slowly, he edged closer to the food, his stance less defensive as he finally took a bite. Sarah felt a mix of relief and growing anticipation. Whatever lay in that duffel bag held some mystery, and something told her they were about to uncover a story deeper than they'd expected. With the dog somewhat pacified, Jake and Sarah exchanged a quick, unspoken understanding. It was time to see what was inside that duffel bag. The dog had relaxed, but he kept his watchful gaze fixed on them, clearly unwilling to fully give up his post. "All right, buddy," Jake murmured, keeping his tone calm. "We're just going to take a peek, okay?" The dog gave a low whine, but he didn't growl. Sarah took this as permission to move forward. She knelt down beside the bag, carefully unzipping it, unsure of what she would find. Inside, her eyes widened at the sight of a tiny, shivering kitten, barely alive and curled up in the corner of the bag. The kitten's fur was wet, its little body visibly weak. Sarah's heart twisted as she gently reached in, her fingers brushing against the soft, fragile form. "Oh, my God, Jake," she whispered. "It's a kitten, and he's not in good shape." Jake leaned over, his face softening as he saw the small creature. "How did you get out here, little one?" he murmured. But the bag held more than just the kitten. As Sarah glanced down, she noticed a few tightly wrapped packages nestled beside the animal. The sight sent a chill down her spine. Small, taped bundles she recognized instantly. Drugs, likely heroin or meth, judging by the shape and size of the packages. Jake's expression turned serious. "Looks like we've got more than we bargained for, Sarah. This little guy might be part of something big." They exchanged a glance of mutual understanding. This wasn't just an abandoned kitten or a random stray guarding a forgotten bag. This was something darker, something more dangerous. The dog, who had watched their every move, whined softly, his eyes flicking back and forth between the kitten and the two deputies. It was as if he knew exactly what was at stake and was pleading with them to understand. Sarah held the kitten close, gently rubbing its tiny head as she felt it shiver against her chest. "You poor thing," she whispered. "Looks like you've been through a lot, huh?" Jake nodded toward the dog. "And it looks like he's been keeping watch over his friend here for a while. No telling how long he's been out here on his own, guarding that bag." The kitten let out a soft, weak mewl, pressing closer to Sarah's warmth. Her protective instincts kicked in immediately. "We have to get this little guy some help, and this changes things. Whoever left this bag here might come back for it." "Yeah, and they're not going to be happy that their stash is gone," Jake replied, glancing around the quiet, empty stretch of road as if expecting trouble to come barreling toward them at any moment. Sarah looked down at the kitten, then back at the dog, who had moved a bit closer, his eyes softer now, his guard finally lowering. She stroked the dog's head gently, murmuring words of reassurance. "You did a good job, boy. You kept him safe. We're going to take it from here." But her mind was already racing. Who would leave drugs with a kitten? And why would they abandon them in such an isolated spot? This wasn't just a chance discovery. It was a piece of a much larger puzzle, and she was determined to find out where it led. With the kitten nestled safely in her arms and Jake keeping an eye on their surroundings, they gathered up the bag, including the suspicious packages. As they headed back to their patrol cars, Sarah felt the weight of what lay ahead. They were about to dive into something far more dangerous than they'd anticipated. As they returned to the patrol cars, Sarah carefully placed the kitten on a soft blanket she kept in the back seat, hoping it would provide some warmth and comfort. The dog followed closely, glancing back at the bag as if afraid it might vanish. He finally settled beside the cruiser, his head resting on his paws, eyes locked on Sarah. "Looks like he's not going anywhere," Jake remarked, watching the dog with a newfound respect. "Guess he's determined to see this through." Sarah nodded, glancing at the small, frail kitten in her car. "I don't blame him. They've probably been through hell together." She let out a sigh, knowing they were only scratching the surface of a much bigger mystery. "But we need to get to the bottom of this. There's an address on the collar. Maybe it's a lead, maybe it's nothing, but it's all we've got right now." Jake nodded in agreement. "Sounds like our best option. Besides, whoever left these drugs out here didn't just forget about them. They'll come looking sooner or later." Sarah agreed, feeling a chill at the thought. Whoever owned those packages wouldn't be thrilled to discover a missing stash, and if they were desperate or violent enough, they might already be watching. She took a deep breath, trying to focus. "Let's head to the address. We'll take the dog with us. He seems to trust us now, at least a little." With the kitten safely in the back seat, Sarah led the way, the dog trotting alongside Jake as he climbed into his car. Their convoy wound through the back roads, taking them deeper into a part of town most people tried to avoid. The houses were older, many of them in a state of disrepair, with boarded-up windows and overgrown lawns. As they neared the address on the kitten's collar, a sinking feeling settled in Sarah's stomach. The house they arrived at was one of the worst on the block, a crumbling, single-story structure with peeling paint, broken windows, and an air of abandonment that sent a shiver down her spine. But something about it felt occupied, like it was hiding secrets behind its tattered curtains. They stepped out of their vehicles, the dog close at Sarah's side. Jake moved toward the house cautiously, his hand hovering near his sidearm as he scanned the area. "Looks like we might be dealing with more than a stray kitten here," he murmured, eyes narrowing as he took in the dilapidated property. Sarah nodded, feeling the tension build. "Stay close and keep an eye out," she whispered. "This could go sideways fast." They approached the door, and Sarah gave a firm knock. For a moment, there was only silence, the faint creak of the house settling around them. Then, just as she was about to knock again, the door opened a crack, revealing a man with a hard expression and sharp eyes. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone defensive. "We're here about a kitten," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady and professional. She held up the collar they'd found, showing him the address. The man's eyes flickered for a moment, and she saw a flash of recognition before he tried to mask it. "Don't know anything about a kitten," he muttered, his voice gruff. "You got the wrong house." Jake stepped forward, his presence calm but authoritative. "Are you sure?" This address was on the collar. "We found the animal abandoned on the side of the road along with some other items." The man's jaw tightened, and Sarah saw his gaze shift nervously to the side. She followed his line of sight to the dim hallway behind him, catching a glimpse of another person lurking in the shadows. Whoever it was quickly stepped back, but not before she noticed a tattoo on their wrist, an insignia she recognized from a past drug investigation. Her senses went on high alert, and she subtly moved her hand toward her radio. "Sir," she said evenly, "we have reason to believe this animal might be connected to some illegal activity. We'd appreciate your cooperation." The man stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "I told you, I don't know anything about that. Now, you need to leave." His voice took on an edge, and she could feel the tension crackling in the air. Sarah held her ground, her gaze steady. "We're not here to cause trouble. But if you know something about that kitten or what was in that bag, now would be a good time to come clean." The man's face twisted in a scowl, and he opened his mouth to respond, but a voice from the back of the house interrupted. "Let them in." Jake and Sarah exchanged a quick glance before stepping cautiously inside. The man closed the door behind them, and the dog moved in close to Sarah, growling softly under his breath. She tightened her grip on the collar, ready for whatever lay ahead. Something told her they were about to uncover much more than they'd anticipated. The air inside the house was thick with the stench of stale smoke and dampness. Sarah scanned the room, noting the peeling wallpaper and the clutter scattered across the floor. There were half-empty bottles on a table, crumpled clothes in a heap near the door, and faded newspapers strewn about. She kept her movements slow, her senses heightened, while the dog stayed close, his nose twitching as he took in the surroundings. From the dimly lit hallway, a woman appeared, her face worn and her gaze piercing. She looked between Sarah and Jake, then down at the dog, who was now standing protectively at Sarah's side. She folded her arms, her expression a mix of resignation and wariness. "Let's get this over with," she muttered, her voice low. "I'll answer your questions, but you have to be quick. We don't want any trouble." Sarah took a careful step forward. "We found a kitten abandoned in a bag on the side of the road. That bag also had other items," she said, choosing her words carefully. She didn't want to provoke the occupants of the house unnecessarily, but she needed them to understand that she wasn't here to play games. "Does that kitten belong to you?" The woman's eyes darted to the side, and for a moment, Sarah saw something shift in her expression, an emotion she couldn't quite place. The woman sighed, rubbing her temples. "Look, the kitten belonged to my sister. She got mixed up with some people. People who don't care about anyone but themselves." Her voice broke slightly, and she shook her head. "She couldn't take care of the little guy anymore, so she left him with us. Said he'd be safer that way." Jake exchanged a glance with Sarah, his gaze sharpening. "And what about the drugs?" he asked, his tone even but firm. "Were those hers too?" The woman looked away, avoiding his eyes. "I don't know anything about that. She was desperate. Maybe she got in over her head with the wrong crowd. All I know is she left the kitten with us and told us to keep an eye on him. Then she vanished." Sarah felt a pang of empathy. It was a story she'd heard too many times. Someone falling on hard times, getting involved with the wrong people, and losing control of their life. But she couldn't let her sympathy cloud her judgment. The fact remained that there were drugs involved, and someone had chosen to leave them in a place where they could have easily been discovered. "Do you have any idea where she is now?" Sarah asked gently, hoping to gain some cooperation. The woman hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "If I did, don't you think I'd go find her?" she replied, her voice tinged with bitterness. "She's gone, left without a word. Just said she couldn't stay here, that they were after her." At that moment, the man from the doorway shifted uncomfortably. Sarah noticed his nervous glances toward the door, as if he was expecting someone to show up any second. She took note of his body language, sensing that he knew more than he was letting on. "Look," Jake interjected, his tone calm but authoritative. "If you know who's after her, you need to tell us. We're trying to help here, but we can't do that if you're holding back information." The woman clenched her fists, her jaw tightening. "I told you all I know. She's gone, and I don't know where. As for who's after her," she paused, glancing nervously at the man. "They're not people you want to mess with. They don't care who gets hurt, as long as they get what they want." Sarah's eyes softened as she looked at the woman. She could see the strain in her face, the worry etched deep into her expression. "We understand that you're scared, but if you want to help your sister, if you want to make sure she's safe, we need everything you can give us." After a long, tense silence, the woman let out a shaky breath. "There's a place downtown, an old warehouse near the river. She used to meet people there sometimes. Said it was her only way to make ends meet." Jake nodded, making a mental note of the location. "Thank you. We'll check it out." As they turned to leave, Sarah glanced down at the dog, who had been watching the entire exchange with an alert, almost protective gaze. She felt a wave of gratitude for his loyalty. Without him, they might never have discovered this lead. They stepped out into the fresh air, the dog trotting faithfully behind them. Sarah and Jake exchanged a glance, both knowing the gravity of what lay ahead. They were walking into potentially dangerous territory, but they had no other choice. This wasn't just about a stray kitten or an abandoned bag of drugs anymore. It was about uncovering the truth and saving a life that had slipped through the cracks. As they climbed back into the car, Sarah looked over at Jake. "Think she'll be there?" He shrugged, his expression grim. "Only one way to find out. Let's hope we're not too late." With the address in hand, they drove off, the weight of their mission heavy in the silence between them. As they pulled away from the dilapidated house, the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. The dog settled into the back seat next to the kitten, who was now resting more comfortably after receiving some water and food Sarah had picked up at a nearby store. Both animals seemed to share a silent understanding, as if they knew they were in this together, clinging to each other in the face of uncertainty. Sarah turned to Jake, her expression resolute. "Let's check the address on this collar before we head to the warehouse. There might be someone there who knows more about this situation. Maybe even someone who's looking for these too." Jake nodded, his eyes fixed on the road. "Good idea. It's not far. Maybe we'll get lucky and find someone who can give us a few answers." They followed the address to a small, humble house tucked away in a quiet neighborhood a few blocks from where they'd been. It was a sharp contrast to the rundown property they'd just left, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The house had a well-kept lawn, and toys were scattered across the yard, hinting at a family with children. As they pulled into the driveway, a woman stepped out onto the porch, her eyes widening as she noticed the patrol car. She approached cautiously, her brow furrowed with concern. Sarah stepped out, holding up her hands in a non-threatening gesture. "Ma'am, I'm Deputy Evans. We're here about a kitten and a dog we found on the side of the road. They had a collar with your address on it." The woman's face transformed from worry to surprise and relief. "You found them?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "My niece's kitten and her dog. They disappeared a few days ago. We've been searching everywhere." She's been frantic. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy. "Is your niece safe?" she asked, choosing her words carefully. She didn't want to raise alarms unnecessarily, but the information they'd received at the other house was enough to make her wary. The woman's face fell, and she glanced away, wringing her hands. "My niece Lila, she's been in a rough spot. She started hanging around with some dangerous people. I don't know much, but she was desperate. Then, out of nowhere, she left the kitten and the dog with me and vanished. I don't know where she is. I've been praying she's safe." Jake and Sarah exchanged a grim look. This was the confirmation they needed, but it added a layer of urgency to their mission. Lila wasn't just a missing person. She was likely running for her life. "We're trying to find her," Sarah said gently. "We think she might be in danger. Any idea where she might have gone?" The woman shook her head, her eyes glistening with tears. "She didn't tell me anything. Just said she couldn't keep the animals with her, that it was safer for them here. I thought maybe she'd come back, but she never did." The dog, who had been watching the woman from the car, let out a small whine, drawing her attention. She approached the cruiser, looking into the back seat with a mixture of sadness and relief. "Oh, you poor things," she murmured, reaching out to scratch the dog behind his ears. "She loved you too so much. I don't know what she got herself into, but I know she wouldn't have left you behind unless she had no choice." Sarah placed a reassuring hand on the woman's shoulder. "We're doing everything we can to find her. We have a lead on a location she might have frequented, a warehouse near the river. We'll check it out." The woman nodded, her face filled with gratitude and worry. "Thank you," she whispered. "Just, if you find her, tell her we love her. And bring her home safe if you can." With a final nod, Sarah and Jake climbed back into the patrol car, their resolve strengthened. The stakes had grown even higher, and the path ahead felt heavy with the unknown. But they had a direction now, and they knew they couldn't turn back. They had a responsibility, not just to the kitten and the dog, but to Lila and the family that wanted her back. As they headed toward the warehouse, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this mission was about more than enforcing the law. It was about rescuing someone who had fallen through the cracks, someone whose life had taken a tragic turn. She looked over at Jake, who gave her a nod, his expression determined. "Let's bring her home," he said quietly, echoing her thoughts. Sarah nodded, gripping the wheel as they neared the warehouse. They were about to enter a world of shadows, but they were prepared to do whatever it took to bring Lila back into the light. As dusk settled in, Sarah and Jake parked a short distance from the warehouse, the sprawling structure looming against the river's edge. The building was old, with rusted metal siding and broken windows, casting an eerie shadow across the ground. The silence in the area was punctuated only by the faint sounds of water lapping against the dock nearby. It was a place that few would venture into willingly, and Sarah could feel the tension creeping into her shoulders as they took in their surroundings. "We should go in quietly," Jake murmured, his eyes scanning the area. "No telling what we'll find in there, and I'd rather we weren't announced." Sarah nodded in agreement, slipping her flashlight into her pocket. They moved cautiously toward the warehouse, keeping low as they approached the side door. The air was thick with the smell of rust and dampness, adding to the uneasy feeling settling in Sarah's gut. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear any movement inside. Faint voices carried through the thin metal walls, the muffled tones suggesting a few people were talking. She caught snippets of a conversation, words like shipment and drop-off that made her skin prickle with alarm. This wasn't just a hideout. It was a hub of some sort, and if Lila had been involved with these people, she was deeper into trouble than anyone had realized. Jake gave her a nod, his face set in a hard line. "Let's go," he whispered. They entered quietly, stepping into a dark corridor lit only by the dim light filtering through the dirty windows. The air was thick with dust, and each step echoed faintly. Sarah's heartbeat thudded in her ears as they moved deeper into the building, following the sounds of voices coming from a large, open room at the end of the hall. Peering around the corner, Sarah spotted a group of 3 men huddled around a table cluttered with bags similar to the ones they'd found with the kitten. Cash was stacked haphazardly beside the bags, and one of the men was counting it while the others checked the contents of the bags, likely drugs, with grim focus. Jake's hand went to his sidearm, but Sarah signaled for him to hold off. Their goal was to find Lila, not to confront an entire operation without backup. They'd need to be smart and quiet. As they backed away from the room, they heard a soft noise, a faint shuffle, like someone moving nearby. They froze, exchanging a quick, wide-eyed glance. The sound was coming from a closed door down the hallway, slightly ajar. Sarah crept over and pushed it open a fraction more, her breath catching as she looked inside. There, curled up on an old mattress, was a young woman who looked to be in her early 20s, her face pale and gaunt. Her eyes were closed, and she was breathing shallowly, clearly exhausted. The faint bruises on her arms and the haunted look on her face were enough to tell Sarah she'd been through hell. "Lila," Sarah whispered softly, hoping not to startle her. The young woman's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, fear flashed across her face. But when she saw Sarah's uniform and the calm, steady gaze, her expression softened, and her eyes filled with relief. Are you here to help me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes, Lila," Sarah replied gently, moving closer. "Your family's worried about you. We're going to get you out of here." Lila's eyes welled up with tears, and she nodded weakly, reaching out as Sarah helped her sit up. She winced, clearly sore and bruised, and Sarah felt a surge of anger at whoever had put her through this ordeal. Jake stepped in, his expression equally grim as he assessed Lila's condition. "We need to move quickly. They're just down the hall." But as they turned to leave, they heard a voice booming from the other end of the hallway. "Hey, what are you doing?" Jake cursed under his breath, positioning himself protectively in front of Lila and Sarah. The men from the room had spotted them, and their expressions twisted with anger as they started down the hall toward them, moving with clear intent. "Sarah, get her out of here," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. "I'll hold them off." Sarah didn't waste a second. She wrapped an arm around Lila's shoulders, supporting her as they moved as quickly as they could down the opposite hall, heading toward an exit door they'd noticed on their way in. The dog, who had been waiting obediently outside, immediately sprang to his feet as they emerged, barking sharply as he sensed the tension in the air. Behind them, Sarah heard the sounds of a scuffle, a thud, a grunt, the shuffle of feet. She knew Jake was handling the men, buying them precious seconds to get Lila to safety, but worry gnawed at her. She urged Lila on, her heart pounding as they made it out of the building and into the night air. With a last look back, Sarah helped Lila into the back seat of her cruiser, and the dog hopped in beside her, curling up protectively as if he understood the urgency. She called for backup, her voice steady but urgent as she relayed their location and the situation inside. Just as she finished the call, Jake appeared, slightly out of breath but unharmed, with a determined expression. They won't be going anywhere until the backup arrives, he said, getting into the passenger seat. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They had Lila, they were safe for the moment, and help was on the way. As they drove back toward the station, Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror at Lila, who was leaning back, her eyes closed, the dog resting his head on her lap. "You're safe now," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with relief and compassion. "We're taking you home." Lila opened her eyes, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't think anyone would come." Jake and Sarah exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between them. This was why they did their job. Moments like this, where they could save someone from the edge and bring them back to the life and the family waiting for them. As they headed back into town, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about protecting people like Lila, people who needed a second chance and someone to believe in them. And as she looked back at the dog, who had risked everything to protect his companion, she knew they had found heroes in the unlikeliest of places. As they arrived at the station, Sarah helped Lila out of the car, her arm wrapped around the young woman's shoulders to steady her. The dog stayed close, his eyes fixed on Lila with unwavering loyalty. Inside, a few officers looked up with curiosity, and Sarah could feel the weight of their silent questions. She knew they'd soon hear the whole story. One of the paramedics stationed at the precinct approached, gently guiding Lila to a seat where he could check her over. Lila was silent, her eyes flicking nervously around the room, clearly overwhelmed. Sarah knelt down in front of her, keeping her voice calm and reassuring. "You're safe here. We'll get you cleaned up, and then you can see your family." Lila's eyes softened, and for the first time, a faint smile flickered across her face. She nodded, the fear in her gaze gradually melting into relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice wavering. "I thought I'd never get out." Sarah placed a comforting hand on her knee. "You're out now, and whatever happened back there, we'll help you get through it." Meanwhile, Jake was updating the other officers, explaining the details of the warehouse operation. The police radio crackled with updates as backup officers arrived at the warehouse to arrest the men they'd left behind. It was clear this wasn't just a small-time operation. The amount of drugs they'd seen suggested a larger network, and this bust might be the start of something bigger. As Jake finished, he joined Sarah and Lila, his expression both sympathetic and focused. "Lila, I know you've been through a lot, but if you feel up to it, any details you can give us about these men would be helpful. We want to make sure they're stopped for good." Lila looked down, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. They found me when I was at my lowest," she admitted quietly. "They said they could help, that they'd give me what I needed to survive. But I didn't realize the cost. When I tried to leave, they threatened me, said they'd hurt me, and anyone I cared about." Her voice trembled, and Sarah could feel the pain radiating from her. She nodded, her expression one of understanding. "You don't have to go into detail now if you're not ready. Just know we're here to protect you." Lila took a shaky breath, her gaze turning to the dog who sat faithfully by her side. She reached out, scratching behind his ears with a gentle touch. "I don't know what I would have done without him. He was the only one who didn't leave me." Sarah felt a lump in her throat at the tenderness of the moment. "He's a brave one, all right," she said with a small smile. "He made sure we found you." The room grew quiet as they watched Lila bond with the dog, each of them feeling the weight of what she'd endured. Sarah knew Lila's journey wasn't over. There would be healing to do, both physically and emotionally, but at least she was no longer alone. After a while, Lila's family arrived. Her aunt, the woman Sarah and Jake had spoken to earlier, rushed over, her face a mixture of worry and joy. She wrapped her arms around Lila, holding her tight, and for a moment, the room seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. "I thought I lost you," her aunt whispered, brushing a strand of hair from Lila's face. "I'm so glad you're safe." Lila hugged her back, her shoulders shaking as she clung to the woman who had stood by her. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I didn't mean to get everyone worried. I thought I could handle it." Her aunt shushed her, pulling her close. "You don't have to do it alone. Not anymore." The reunion was a reminder of why Sarah and Jake did this job, to bring people back from the brink and give them a chance to start fresh. Watching them, Sarah felt a profound sense of purpose. As Lila's family prepared to take her home, she turned to Sarah and Jake, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you, but thank you for not giving up on me." Jake gave her a reassuring nod. "Take care of yourself, Lila. And remember, if you ever need help, you know where to find us." With that, Lila and her family left, the dog happily trotting at her side, his loyalty unwavering. Sarah watched them go, feeling a warmth in her chest. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy for Lila, but she'd taken the first step, and that counted for a lot. As they stood in the quiet aftermath, Jake turned to Sarah with a wry smile. "Not bad for a day's work," Sarah chuckled, feeling the tension in her shoulders finally ease. Yeah, not bad at all. But beneath the satisfaction, she knew there was still work to be done. The men at the warehouse were just part of a larger puzzle, and she was determined to see it through. She looked at Jake, both of them sharing a silent understanding. They were ready for whatever came next. And as they walked back to their patrol cars, Sarah couldn't help but glance one more time toward the street where Lila and her family had disappeared. She felt a quiet hope that this wouldn't be just another case, that Lila would find her way back, and that maybe, just maybe, the work they did really could make a difference. The next morning, Sarah and Jake returned to the station, ready to piece together everything they'd learned from the night before. The bust at the warehouse had yielded more than just a few arrests. The men they'd apprehended had turned out to be part of a larger network, a smuggling ring trafficking drugs through small towns just like theirs. It was the beginning of a trail that stretched far beyond the borders of their county. As Sarah reviewed the case notes, she felt the familiar adrenaline surge of an investigation on the verge of breakthrough. The evidence collected from the warehouse and the information Lila had reluctantly provided gave them more insight into the operation's reach. She had mentioned specific names and places, dropping hints about drop-off points and contacts. Each piece fit together, painting a picture of a carefully orchestrated scheme. Chief Reynolds, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a steely gaze, called Sarah and Jake into his office. He held a thick stack of files, each detailing past cases that had once seemed isolated but now appeared to be interconnected. "We've been watching these guys for a while," Chief Reynolds said, flipping through the files. "They're slippery. We'd find a small amount of product, arrest a low-level courier, but never the ones running the operation. Last night's raid was a turning point." Sarah leaned forward, listening intently. "So we're looking at a coordinated network with people on the inside?" The chief nodded. "Exactly. They use people like Lila, vulnerable folks who think they're out of options. They make them dependent, and then they turn them into assets, couriers. It's manipulative and, unfortunately, effective." Jake shook his head, his jaw tightening. "They take advantage of people at their lowest. They know how to pick out those who feel like they have no choice." The chief handed them a new file, thicker than the previous ones. "This is where you two come in. We're coordinating with other departments. This case just became a priority. I want you both to lead the charge from here. Gather intel, connect with our informants, and track down anyone associated with these men." As Sarah took the file, she felt the weight of the task. But it was more than just another case to her now. It was personal. She had seen the damage this network could do, had met the people left in its wake, and she knew that taking it down was the only way to bring any lasting peace to families like Lila's. Jake glanced at her, his expression serious. "Let's get to work." Over the next few days, they pored over every piece of evidence they had, tracking down leads, talking to informants, and gathering intel on the people involved. It was exhausting work, but with each breakthrough, they inched closer to understanding how the network operated and who was pulling the strings. They discovered that the warehouse was just one of several distribution points. The drugs were being transported along back roads, carefully avoiding the major highways and populated areas to avoid detection. The network extended into other states, with connections to suppliers in urban centers and ties to local communities through contacts like the men they'd arrested. Late one night, Sarah and Jake found themselves combing through surveillance footage from various locations around town, trying to piece together the movements of known associates. As they studied the footage, Jake broke the silence. "You know, I keep thinking about that dog. The way he protected the kitten and led us to Lila. If it weren't for him, she might still be out there. Sarah smiled, nodding. Yeah, it's strange how things work out sometimes. I think that dog was her guardian in more ways than one. It makes you wonder if animals know more about loyalty and protection than we give them credit for. The conversation faded as they continued their work, sifting through images, documents, and interview transcripts. Hours later, just as dawn was beginning to break, they found the lead they'd been hoping for, a connection to a small cabin on the outskirts of town, where one of the ringleaders was rumored to stay. It was a remote place, far enough from prying eyes, yet close enough to the warehouse for easy access. Sarah leaned back, her eyes bright with renewed energy. This might be it, Jake. This could be where they're hiding out and coordinating the drops. Jake nodded, already reaching for the radio. I'll get a team together. We're going to need backup on this one. As the morning light began to fill the room, they felt the thrill of a plan coming together. They were ready to take down the people responsible and put an end to the operation that had plagued their town. This time, they had the advantage. With Lila's information, the evidence. As they headed back to their patrol car, Jake glanced at Sarah, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I'll admit, when you first called me out to check on a dog by the side of the road, I didn't think it would end here. Sarah laughed, the sound light and free for the first time in days. Neither did I, but I think that dog knew more than we did. Maybe he sensed it was time for things to change. They drove back in companionable silence, the satisfaction of a job well done filling the car. They had come full circle, from a mysterious duffel bag guarded by a loyal dog to the takedown of an entire smuggling network. And as they entered the town limits, Sarah felt a quiet hope for the future, a hope that the peace they'd fought for would last. When they arrived at the station, they were met with applause and congratulations from their fellow officers, the weight of the investigation finally lifting as they shared the moment with their team. As Sarah walked toward her desk, she glanced over at Jake, giving him a nod of appreciation. This was a victory they'd earned together, and she knew she couldn't have done it without him. That afternoon, as Sarah left the station, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew there would be other cases, other challenges, but today was a reminder that even the smallest actions, a dog by the roadside, a call for backup, could lead to something greater. And as she headed home, she couldn't help but think of the kitten and the dog, the silent heroes who had started it all. They had led her to something bigger than she could have imagined, and for that, she would always be grateful. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and check out this next story. It's truly moving.